evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me even in the way back? All right, good. So I want to welcome everybody to our guest speaker series. It's been a long time. This is the first time we've been able to have a group like this in about 18 months. So welcome back. And it's nice to see such a full house because I wasn't sure how many people we were going to have tonight. And I think you used up all my chairs. So now I know my maximum capacity here. But tonight we have Bill Kauffman here to talk about his latest work, the Congressional Journal of Barber Conable, which we do have copies still in the gift shop if anybody's interested. And if we run out, I have ordered more already. So just stop back by another time and we'll have a copy for you. Bill has written several books, and we have several of those even also in the bookstore, so I'm really trying to pump up your sales, Bill. So,
a little more enthusiasm.
That's right.
What's too dead, He's being honest.
All right. Well, there goes all the nice things I was going to say about Bill. But he's been done a lot for the museum here, so we're happy to have him back to speak again. I do want to announce the presence of a couple honored guests here. Emily Conable and James Schmieder are here, or Barber's daughters, so it's nice of them to. And if you are so inclined, afterwards we do have a little bit of a display set up back there with some memorabilia and pictures and things from Barber and the family, so feel free to enjoy those. And we do have some water, coffee, and cookies on the table. There's still some left. Jim Owen hasn't eaten all of them yet, so we'll okay. And just so everybody knows, this is actually going to be up on our YouTube channel after tonight. Mr. Paul Figlow is doing that for us. And I didn't know this, but Howard Owen's here from Batavian, so I'll also be on there. So we're all going to be famous. But I've talked long enough, so Bill, you are more than welcome to come on up.
Thanks, Ryan. Can you hear me? Yeah. Great. Thank you all for coming. It's a great turnout. Let's violate the fire code. Eh? Hi, also Gretel, Lucine, Mark, Jane. It's great to be back. I served for years on the board of the Holland Purchase Historical Society, along with Barber and Charlotte Conable. The Conables used to call it the Hysterical Society. I'm sure it's calmed down since then. It's close to 60 years since Barber Conable was first elected to public office. Time doth fly. Conable was as highly and widely respected as any member of Congress in the last half of the 20th century, according to Richard Fenno, the Dean of Congressional Scholars. But fame is fleeting in our TikTok age. If you're not yet eligible for membership in the AARP, you probably don't remember the greatest political figure by far our region has ever produced. Barber Benjamin Conable Jr. was born November 2nd, 1922 in Warsaw. He had a patriotic pedigree. An ancestor, Thomas Crafts, had been both participant and supplier of the Mohawk Indian dress for the Boston Tea Party. Barber's father, Barber Sr., served 28 years as Wyoming County Judge and was succeeded by his son John, who served 32 years in that position, which is why miscreants in the county to our south have justice inflicted upon them today in the Conable courtroom. Young Barber hated his first name. You know how little kids are, cruel to their very marrow. He was teased by classmates with an old nursery rhyme. Barber, barber, shave a pig. How many hairs will make a wig? 4 and 20, that's enough. Give the barber a pinch of snuff. That one was obsolete by the time I was a tyke. Maybe it made him tough, a la Johnny Cash's Boy Named Sue. And its distinctiveness would come in handy for the candidate. During Barber's first congressional race, a barbershop quartet of young women sang for him. And even late into his career, some of his less attentive constituents were sure that they were represented by a nice lady named Barbara. Barber and his two brothers were drilled by their parents in the fundamentals of civic and personal responsibility, though the lessons were leavened with a dollop of agrarian eccentricity. His father had them recite Shakespeare and poetry as they milked the cows. Curiously, another of our native sons, the novelist John Gardner, had the same eccentric poetry reciting cow milking experience. So I'm thinking we must have very literate cows around here. Barber's mother and grandmother, Margaret Gownlock, were suffragists. His grandmother was a close friend of Susan B. Anthony's. So I came by my feminism honestly, he said. I wasn't just being a milquetoast for my wife's enthusiasm. Barber attended Cornell, where he majored in medieval history and helped to organize the Anti-War America First Committee. Like his father, he was a pacifist who opposed U.S. involvement in foreign wars. But after graduating Cornell at age 19, he enlisted in the Marines over the bitter objections of his father, and eventually went ashore as a second lieutenant at Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. He remembered thinking as he landed on the beach at the base of Mount Suribachi, "My God, I'm going to be killed on my father's birthday." He received nary a scratch. Then came law school. He graduated first in his class at Cornell, an unhappy stint with a prestigious Buffalo law firm in the Korean War, after which Barber and his new bride, Charlotte Williams, a Buffalo native and Cornell graduate, moved to Batavia. This is how he later described his introduction to our fair city. The day I came to Batavia and opened my law office, I rented a little office up over 12 Main Street in the Schaefer building for $55 a month. It was in bad shape and I had to go down and get some stuff to fix it up. I went to the nearest hardware store, Genesee Hardware, 3 or 4 doors down from where I was. Carl Buchholz was standing behind the counter. He looked up at me and turned white. He said, "My God, you must be related to George Gownlock." I said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, he was a first cousin of mine." He says, "Who are you?" I said, "My name is Conable and I'm from Warsaw." He said, "What are you doing here?" Batavia's very welcoming city. I said, "Well, I'm opening a law office down the street." He said, "You'll be my lawyer. George was my best friend." George Gownlock was killed on D-Day at Normandy Beach. Conable continues. Carl was the president of the Rotary Club, and 3 months later he rammed me into the Rotary Club over the dead body of every other lawyer in town. The following year I directed the Rotary Club show, and the following year I was the president of the Rotary Club. And that became a very important part of my clientele. I ran 3 major fund drives the first 6 months I was in Batavia because I didn't have anything else to do. Charlotte was working at the YWCA to eke out a living for us because I wasn't making any money. The law held few charms for him. He recalled, "I was not a tremendously successful lawyer because I cut my fees to everybody on the grounds that I didn't think my services were worth much. And I became everybody's slave, particularly people who were looking for cheap lawyers." All I could think of is that Jim Owen probably would have used him in the 1950s.
The word is conservative.
Barber got involved in politics as chairman of the City of Batavia's Republican Committee. After he and Charlotte bought a circa 1830 hybrid Federal Greek Revival home in Alexander, today the home of Matt and Molly Grimes, he took on the job of Genesee County Republican campaign chairman, and in 1962 he made a fateful decision. He challenged the powerful and corrupt state senator from this district, one Austin Irwin. Conable told the Genesee County Republican Party chairman, "I won't be campaign chairman if that old bastard Austin Irwin is on the ticket because he's a crook." In fact, said Conable, he just might run against Irwin in a primary. The chairman warned Conable that he'd be throwing away his career if he challenged Irwin. It was one of those "you'll never work again in this town" punk moments. Undaunted, Conable threw his hat in the ring. Irwin backed down. Conable whipped an Irwin protege, and a career was launched. By the way, there's an Austin Irwin Hall in SUNY Geneseo. I suppose that's why the whole class is in bribery and kickbacks. 2 years later, after making a name for himself in the New York State Senate with his heroic defense of rural schools against the technocratic onslaught of consolidation, Conable was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He would serve 10 terms, or 20 years in Congress, and on multiple occasions, he was voted the most respected member of the House by staffers, journalists, and his fellow members. He was distinctive in several ways. For one, Conable, virtually alone among members of Congress, wrote his own newsletter to constituents. Pretty much every other member filled, and today fills, his or her newsletter with braggadocio, self-glorification, photos of the member handing out government money to beaming supplicants. These newsletters are a taxpayer-subsidized joke. Conable didn't do that. He wrote thoughtful meditations on the issues of the day or the responsibilities of a congressman. He viewed these as partly educational, partly conversational. Senator Pat Moynihan, who greatly admired Conable, announced with fanfare that he too was going to write his own newsletters. But after a couple of such essays, things got in the way. Conable drove his colleagues nuts with his fundraising practices. Early in his career as a member of the Tax Writing Ways and Means Committee, he had seen votes traded for contributions, so he set a strict limit of $50 on gifts to his own campaigns. He joked that it merely signified that he could be bought more cheaply than any other member of the House. Gerald Ford and other party leaders badgered him on this, saying, come on, man, you're making us look bad. I don't think Ford said, come on, man. But Conable refused to budge, even in the Watergate election of 1974, when the Democrats ran the charismatic vice mayor of Rochester, Midge Costanza, against him. Midge outspent him 2-1, and the poll said he was on the ropes, but Conable won. Conable had an almost mystical connection to his district, at least the portion of it that included Genesee and Wyoming counties. Richard Fenno, the legendary political scientist whom I mentioned at the outset, traveled with Conable as he was writing his classic book, Homestyle. Fenno wrote, "From the time we spent driving through the district during that first visit, I picked up something more basic and more permanent. His attachment to a place, and the values and practices of that place. His comment to me about his identification with the rural people of his district was almost poetic in nature, because it came just as we left the 4-lane superhighway from Rochester and turned onto the 2-lane road to Byron. Suddenly he said, 'It must be terrible to be without roots, without a place to call home. I have a profound sense of identification with these rural people. I worry about the rootlessness of our people, about the changes that are taking place in our values, which were, after all, pretty durable.' Soon he brightened and said, 'It won't be long now. Here are the Byron suburbs. Those are Gerald Britt's beets growing over there. He grows 3% of all the edible beets in the United States.'" Here's Conable again, or here's Fenno again, rather. "During my first visit, Conable displayed another personal behavior pattern that distinguished him from every elected politician I would ever know. It was a distinctiveness related partly to shared rural small-town values, expectations, and partly to his self-confidence in connecting with his constituents. Not once in all our time together did a staff person accompany us, not in the car and not at any event." As the years went by, the plaudits for Barber Conable piled up. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the journalists who uncovered Watergate, said that, quote, "He was regarded by his colleagues as almost puritanical in his standards of personal and political conduct, a man of unquestioned integrity," end quote. George Will concluded, quote, "There has never been a better congressman," end quote. Conable declined to seek re-election in 1984. 20 years, he said, was enough. He was showered with offers to sell out as a lobbyist, but rejected them all. As he once said to me, "Now why would I stick around Washington? That's what many of my colleagues do. They stay there and practice law or lobby, and that's one of the most foolish things in the world. There's nothing deader than a dead politician. I recall my dear friends Wilbur Mills and Al Ullman coming to lobby me after they had gone to their rewards one way or another, and I would duck into doorways to avoid them, because they would be asking me for things that I knew they didn't believe in. You're pure mercenaries." By the way, almost everyone who has represented this congressional district in the 30 years since Conable retired stayed in D.C. and exploited their position for personal financial gain. They pay lip service to Barber Conable, but they don't follow his example. To his surprise, Conable was offered the job of president of the World Bank by President Reagan. He accepted, served a 5-year term, and then came home to Alexandria. Over the next dozen years, he moved seamlessly between worlds. One day he would fly to Washington to chair the Smithsonian's Board of Regents, And the next night, he and Charlotte will be sitting around the table here with those of us on the board of the Hysterical Society. Mr. Conable manned the cash box at the Society's annual yard sale. As then museum director Pat Wyson joked to him, Conable was qualified for this job by virtue of having been a teller at the World Bank. Parenthetically, one of the most breathtaking acts of parliamentary maneuvering I ever saw was performed at an Historical Society annual meeting back in the 1990s, when Mr. Conable and J.D. Lasser disposed of a really vexatious problem in the Society, and Mrs. Conable put a classy and graceful period at the end of it. In retirement, Barber Conable gave a dozen or so talks a year on local history and culture. Every July 4th, he read the Declaration of Independence in his booming stentorian voice at the Genesee Country Village and Museum. Saturday mornings, he kept his date for coffee with the boys at Carl Buchholz's Genesee Hardware, even though by now the boys were in their 80s. It reminds me when I was a kid, we'd see these stooped, ancient old ladies walking down the street, and my dad would say, "Oh, there go the Mar girls." The last time I saw Barber Conable, he spoke plaintively about the ephemeral nature of his legislative accomplishments, likening them to footprints on a sandy beach, washed away by the tide. His most lasting achievement, he said with bemusement, seemed to be his authorship of the provision in the 1978 tax bill that effectively legalized home brewing and made him the legislative father of the microbrewery revolution. He said he'd merely done it as a favor for a constituent and had no idea that he was releasing a veritable ocean of IPAs and porters on a thirsty nation. In 2018, Jane Conable Schmieder, one of Barbara and Charlotte's 4 children, asked if I'd like to read the journal her father kept for 17 of his 20 years in Congress. I knew about it. He'd occasionally read an excerpt to visitors. But Mr. Conable had left instructions that it was to be kept largely off limits for a period of time sufficient that most of those mentioned therein would have passed away. He didn't want to embarrass anyone, not even the scoundrels. I read the journal and was tremendously impressed. Most of it was spoken into a dictaphone while he commuted to and from work, or on the drive from Washington to Alexander and back. Yet it reads as if composed while he was sitting at a desk. How a person can drive through Rock Creek Parkway traffic while speaking in complete sentences and felicitous prose is beyond me. I'd hate to have been driving the car next to him. Anyway, I suggested that we get the journal published, and the University Press of Kansas, probably the best political science press in the country, brought it out this month. To get it down to a publishable length, I had to cut it from about 400,000 to about 150,000 words. This is a rare genre. There have been very few congressional diaries published, and most are basically political advertisements depicting their authors as valorous knights of the Round Table doing battle against the evil forces of the opposing party. Conable's journal, written in real time and kept under lock and key for decades, is a warts and all description of how a bill becomes a law, what a congressman does, and what many of the notable and notorious personages of his era were like. I'm told that Mr. Conable always wanted to write a novel about the early European settlement of our area. He never did, but as the journal reveals, he had a talent for describing people. There are sharply incised portraits of presidents, would-be presidents, and both the fearless and the spearless leaders of his day. Richard Nixon, Wilbur Mills, Jack Kemp, Bob Dole, George Bush, and a cast of hundreds. Among them, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I've been lucky. Richard Fenno, the great congressional scholar, was my mentor at the U of R. Barber Conable was my friend, and Pat Moynihan was my boss for 2.5 years. I didn't feel so lucky at the time. But in retrospect, my Moynihan experience provided a great education. Conable and Moynihan had a really interesting mutual admiration society that was punctuated by fierce quarrels. Conable always split his ticket in the voting booth to cast a vote for the Democrat Moynihan. And Moynihan once enraged local Democrats by showing up at a Republican rally in Batavia during election season and telling the astonished audience that Congress without Barber Conable is unthinkable. But Moynihan also disappointed Conable, who praised him one minute and called him a blatherer and a jowl-shaking party hack the next. Yet Moynihan, for all his manifold flaws, had a profound understanding and appreciation of New York State, all its regions, and of Barber Conable. Mr. Conable once told me this story. Senator Jack Danforth had a little Social Security amendment that was stupid and wasn't going to go anywhere. We had a conference on the bill that included this amendment of his. Nobody on the House side wanted it, and not many on the Senate side, but Moynihan gets up and makes a speech about this wonderful amendment. Jack was looking over at us and hoping someone would say something on the House side. I finally got up and said I hadn't really supported this at the outset, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought it was something we could live with. Pat was sitting at the other end of the semicircle of conferees. He took his pencil out of his mouth, threw it down on the table, and it bounced way up. He stalked around the back of the circle, came over and sat in the empty seat next to me, and said, I would do my Moynihan impression here, but I haven't had anything to drink yet. Now, Conable, are you or are you not an unreconstructed conservative Republican upstate bastard? I said, now don't give me a tough time on this, Pat, you supported it. He said, yes, but I am not an unreconstructed conservative Republican upstate bastard. I said, well, Pat, you know it's not going anywhere, and I wanted to give a little vote of confidence to Jack Danforth, the sweet man. Don't worry, none of my boys are going to vote for it. And he said, well, Conable, I want to tell you, if you aren't an unreconstructed conservative Republican upstate bastard, what good are you? Gosh, that's the second time I've used the B word in this talk. I'm only quoting other people. I eschew profanity. Sometimes. Except in books. Barber Conable always had the great virtue of frankness and candor, though at times he worried it would be his undoing. He had been a congressman for only 6 years when he was elevated into the House leadership, and at meetings with President Nixon, he was forthright, speaking his mind. After those meetings, he wondered why his colleagues clammed up and left the blunt talk to him. He was actually a key Nixon ally in Nixon's first term because he agreed with several of Nixon's domestic initiatives. For the longest time, he refused to say whether he'd vote to impeach the president or not. He held to this quaint Boy Scout notion that maybe he should actually read all the evidence before making up his mind. But once he realized that Nixon had lied to the country and to him, he was furious. Nixon sent him letters of explanation and apology after his resignation. Conable refused to answer them. He was a close friend and ally of Gerald Ford's when Ford was House Republican Minority Leader. In fact, Betty Ford blamed Conable for her husband's ascension to the vice presidency and later presidency. He had no illusions that Ford was particularly bright or skillful. At one point, he records feeding Ford a witty line to use before the cameras, and of course, Ford messes it up. But he had great respect for Ford's basic decency and honesty and openness. Conable consistently underestimated Ronald Reagan's political appeal, in part because he was chairman of the National Steering Committee of his former Ways and Means colleague and good friend George H.W. Bush's 1980 presidential campaign. Conable was a great booster of the first Bush, though we came to view him as excessively timid and too much a party man. Barber Conable died on November 30th, 2003. Charlotte passed in 2013. Their stone is in the Alexander Village Cemetery, on whose board of trustees Barber served. The Conable plot is in the western verge of the cemetery, adjacent to a pasture. He wanted the Schmieder cows to come to his funeral, said his daughter Emily. The couple is commemorated with a black marble bench on which is etched the message, "Reach out." Every May, the village of Alexander is brilliant with flowering crabapple trees that line its streets. These were a gift from Barber Conable. As his daughter Jane explained, he loved Alexander. He was so enormously attached to that place as his home that he wanted to give it a beautiful gift and pay it back, at the same time making it more beautiful with its own special identity. If we in Genesee County are to retain our own special identity, we need to pay it back too. One way to do so is to remember, to honor, and each in our own way to emulate Barber Conable. Thanks for listening. If anyone has any questions, I'll do my best to dodge them.
How did you decide on the 250,000 words not print from the journal?
Some of it was easy. I mean, there was some repetition. And there were accounts of like visits to embassies and that sort of thing that I thought we could excise easily. There was some talk about wasn't really much talk about local politics, other than like redistricting every 10 years. And he had a lot of complaints about the Monroe County Republican Party. Sorry, Pat. But actually, you know, he never ragged on anyone from Genesee County. I mean, it's not like I didn't protect anyone or anything. He had no complaints. But anyway, so I got it down to like 180, 190,000, and then Bob Berry, who was the longtime editor of Congressional Quarterly, he was very helpful with all this, and so he helped me cut the last 30,000 words or so. So I mean, I'm sure there's some good stuff on the cutting room floor, but you know, the publisher didn't want it over 350 pages or whatever it is. So yeah. Any other questions?
I got a little comment for you.
Oh, hold on. Okay. Where's it coming?
My name is Jim Gillen. I'm from Warsaw.
Hi.
I rode over with Barbara's cousin, Lieutenant.
Hi.
Things weren't always tough for the Canables, you know. My brother was a part of the football team in 38 and 39, Warsaw High School. Played with Barbara. After the war, Barbara played a couple games with our Warsaw Merchants town team football, which I played a couple games on. John Conable, his brother, played with him. We both agreed that guards should tackles, tougher than hell.
What are they?
Oh, God. Stay out of their way.
What position did you play?
Him.
Okay.
I was the shortest end in the whole league.
Well, probably the speediest, I'm sure.
But more importantly, something I tell my grandkids. Summer, 1938. My brother, Barber Conable, possibly John, and 8 or 10 other athletes and decent young men from Warsaw. Many, many days of a week, of a month, we traveled to the farm on Allegheny Road in the town of Castile and hoe beans, dry beans. 15 cents an hour. Tell that to your grandkids. They throw pennies in the parking lot, you know. If they did, I'd be out there picking them up. That's all I got to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Eric?
Kind of tied to that. Did he talk about baseball at all? The Senators or Muck Dogs or anything?
No, I don't think he did. And Jane and Emily will be able to. I got the feeling that he followed football maybe a little, but was not a baseball fan.
Yeah, he was mostly shouting at the screen.
Was it?
Yeah, football was an opportunity to, scream and yell and have a lot of fun.
All right. Was it the Bills or the Redskins he was following?
Redskins.
Okay.
No.
According to Don Boston, they're still the Redskins.
Dave?
You had written in some recent article about this book that friendship must always trump politics, always. So a comment on that in general, and specifically how that might have shaped Conable's legislating and governance when he was together.
Yeah, it's interesting. He, among the a handful of other members of Congress that he praises, and they're evenly split really between Republicans and Democrats. I mean, he admired and was friends with some of the most liberal Democrats in the House and some of the most conservative Republicans, just as he was scornful and contemptuous of some of the most liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans who he thought were lazy or dishonest or whatever. And I mean, he was in some ways he was a man of the center, but that's, you think boring. But his views were much more nuanced and interesting than that. And and friendship should always trump politics. We should know.
Part of the friendships that he had were because he was sitting next to people in committee, and that's how he got to be friends with George Bush or Jerry Ford. They were sitting next to each other for hours and hours and hours while Dad doodled, and they would chat, and then they would trade doodles, and then they would get all the work done. But it really came down to who you were sitting next to and spending so much time with, and those friends lasted.
Yeah, because you start. I think you start. In fact, I think he made a comment once about how important it is to see people multidimensionally, you know? Instead of just seeing someone saying Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, whatever. I mean, once you know them in a rounded way, and you know other things about them, and you've seen them in other contexts, it's hard to be mad at them, or you know, that's not to get a soapbox, but today too much. I think we see people unidimensionally, you know, and they're not real people to us, you know.
Well, you also have to remember Dad was in the minority for 20 years, and to do anything he had to get along.
Right.
Everybody, and it was very, very frustrating to him.
Yeah, it was.
You were very clear about that in the book. The choices you made, I thought, painted a picture that was starker than I realized, certainly. So I learned things.
Yeah, I thought one thing that was interesting is because he's very honest, and he's sometimes not quite despairing, but he asks himself every couple of years. He says, like, what am I doing here? You know, I'm not getting anything done. What's the point? What's life about? You know, which I don't know if you guys saw that at home, but he was. I mean, obviously, usually he's cheerful and bright and go get him, but there were moments of, I thought, this really interesting kind of poetic melancholy to him.
Yeah, it's true. Well, played football. He was very headlong. I mean, he loved to rush at things and rush at people and grab their lapels and shake them. And when he couldn't accomplish anything, what do you do next? So he started looking.
You could always say the government's working exactly how it was designed. Not very well.
Didn't he in his last newsletter say the system's designed not to work? Something like that?
I think so, yes.
Because I sort of remember reading that and it just, it's, being very cumbersome and very tough to get things passed and you need to compromise.
Well, he was saying too, that was a good thing that it was cumbersome, so you couldn't just yank things in and yank them out and do it quickly without a lot of thought.
Mm-hmm.
So you had plenty of time to give it consideration
Right.
because it was just a slow mechanism.
Yeah.
Which makes me crazy.
Anyone?
What do you think motivated him to operate with such integrity? Like having value?
Yeah, I assume it was
Repeat
his.
the question.
Oh, what motivated him to operate with such integrity?
Okay.
I assume it was his milieu, his upbringing. I think, his parents, his family, his football teammates. I think he was raised well. He was raised with a real sense of civic responsibility and what Gore Vidal used to call proprietary patriotism, where there's a sense that country belongs to me, and it's up to me to to pitch in, and yeah, I think he had that kind of sense of obligation.
So how do we get a copy of that book to everyone in Congress now?
Okay.
I would certainly contribute to that fund.
Yeah, sure. If you're going to buy 435 copies, I'm sure they can give you a discount. I agree. I mean, he would have been unusual at any point. I mean, to me, he was kind of what James Madison and those guys had imagined a congressman might be like, and obviously, precious few have ever lived up to that kind of standard. But he did, and we were very lucky to have him. And it's those who remember when he was around, he was just around town. You see him.
He loved being around. He did. Coffee with the boys. That was a really big deal. He loved that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So as was mentioned, that in Congress and committee, they would sit Republican, Democrat. Do you have any idea how they gather in today's Congress? Are they segregated?
I think it's still the same, on different sides, but you're still gonna talk to each other a lot. But I'm not so far out of it. But my impression is just a lot of polarization, and there's not a lot of.
I'm just wondering how being next to each other like that. Meltdown that.
Yeah, proximity does that. I mean, sometimes you're thrown together on a project with people that might be very different from you, and yet you find you can work harmoniously, and even if you can't, sometimes you got to cooperate with people.
Did he have a hard time going from a pacifist to a warrior?
I don't know. I asked him about that once, and he said that Because, you know, I mean, because pacifism was once a very potent force in this country. It was generally a presumption against wars, and you know, often it was related to religious. I don't think his father was a religious person. But he said he came to the conclusion that that was a just war, and that his friends and people he grew up with were going off to fight it, and he thought he probably should too.
I think there was a switch that flipped during Pearl Harbor. That did. I think he just turned at that point. He realized he had enough credits to graduate early, so he could enlist. He said, I all of a sudden realized it was my war.
Yeah, I graduated at age 19.
We also never talked about the war to us at all.
No?
Nothing. Wouldn't speak. So I've actually learned more from other people who were on Iwo Jima than I ever learned from that.
Yeah. And he never exploited his, Iwo Jima, the heroism for political gain. I don't think he even mentioned it in his campaigns. You know, I mean, you'd think some of these guys, you know, they don't go 2 minutes without asking you to thank them. But no, he was. He thought it would be tawdry to campaign as a war.
Yeah, duty was a big word in our house. Duty to your country, to your party, and to your family. And that was how we lived.
Are there other writers or books out there in the wind that maybe tackle this subject from a different perspective? Not necessarily the diary, but Conable is a...
A guy named Jim Fleming was a professor at RIT, published a biography, maybe 10 years, a number of years ago, and that's a good book. So that, and I suppose these two could be kind of companions or complementary.
Well, the difference is he never let Jim Fleming touch the journals. He was not allowed. Dad would read aloud from the journals, and Jim would take notes. So it's still very much Dad's voice, but he didn't touch the journals. They were really under lock and key.
Yeah.
But that book is based more on what he wrote in his newsletters. That's a newsletter-based account. So you hear his voice, but it's different than what you hear in the journal.
Yeah. I remember when Jane said, "Hey, you want to be the first person ever to read the journal?"
Yes.
I do. And then she hands me like this. Where's Evelyn Wood when you need her? But it was a great honor. Great honor. It was fun. Enjoyed it.
Thank God somebody typed it.
Yes.
You would never be able to read
You'd
it.
still be reading.
Yeah, the typists were really heroines of the project.
His handwriting was really bad.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming out again. It's great to see everybody and some new faces. There's still some cookies left. Take them, please. I don't need any more. And be sure to check out some of the displays. The museum will be open for a little while, so if you want to walk through for a time, and the bookstore is open. Wink, wink. If you're interested. And just a quick announcement: our next guest speaker series will be August 18th. Derek Maxfield, who is a professor at the GCC, will be talking to us about his book Halmyra that he wrote last year about the Halmyra Civil War prison. So if you're interested in that, let me know, and we'll see you then. So otherwise, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Were you not? Good.